A Gap in the Spectrum is Marilyn Duckworth's first novel, written in 1959 when she was 23 years old. It is a novel whose strange and quiet compulsiveness entitles it to a very long reading life. It was published by New Authors Limited, an imprint of Hutchinson's in London. It was republished in 1986 by Oxford University Press. The silent, brilliant whirlpool of imagination that this novel discovers makes it an outstanding addition to the New Authors list. A Gap in the Spectrum by Marilyn Duckworth, read by Sarah D.
Chapter 9. He rang the following evening to ask me to a show up in London, which he had tickets for. "And so you're going on the continent?" he added, when there was a pause in the conversation. "Oh, yes," I began eagerly. "How did you know?" "Your father told us. Are you pleased about it? It would have been a shame not to while you were over here, wouldn't it?" "It would, yes. We're going in a couple of weeks. I've just broken the news to Mrs. Muir. She's been awfully nice about it." I lowered my voice, for she was in the next room. I can't hear you. I've got a bit of a hangover. Went to a mad party last night." He sounded depressed, so I said quickly, "I'll be looking forward to the show on Friday. Thank you so much for asking me, Stephen." When I rang off, I found some of Stephen's apparent depression had transferred itself to me. Upstairs in my bedroom, I hunched my knees up in front of the fire and thought about the telephone conversation. Stephen had asked if I was pleased about going. Well, was I? It seemed fantastic to me that I should prefer not to go, merely so that I could visit a film with Stephen occasionally. As I've said before, I had never come up against someone I knew falling in love in Mechold, except in a very dull way. The idea that it could happen to me was even more unbelievable, and yet I couldn't help thinking of it now. After all, I was in a different world. Maybe falling in love was easy. Perhaps it could happen to a person more than once, and at the same time, like it had in a novel I had just finished. A knot of pleasure swelled quickly in me, but was followed by a sudden uneasiness. It seemed more important than ever that Stephen should find my behaviour normal and natural. Up to now, it had been easy to conceal that the life I remembered most clearly was of in another world. Would it remain easy? If I ever had to confess my story, he would think I was mad. It would be useless trying to convince him that it had really happened. For a moment, an awful feeling came over me. There was no one I could really relax with and be comforted by. Even back in Mechold, it would be the same. I would always be sandwiched between two worlds, always acting, never sure which was the real me. Reaching out quickly for a pamphlet on Paris, I spread it on my knees and tried to read. But it was no use. Soon I lowered my head onto it and felt tears run across the paper. We left for the continent 2 weeks later. It all seems rather jumbled now, the trains, the foreign porters, my father frowning over the itinerary. I wore my thick pink coat and shabby boots all the time while travelling, and carried a stubby umbrella with the head snapped off, threaded through the straps of my case. I took a lot of travel sickness pills, contrary to my mother's advice, and perhaps that accounts for the strange aura of confusion that surrounds my recollection of the whole 6 weeks. I remember one afternoon clearly, however, and for no particular reason. We were staying at a spotlessly clean but extremely cold hotel in Belgium. There was a lot of dazzling white and of bare-stained wood. The 3 of us had been given a room with a double and a single bed. Apparently, this was considered quite respectable on the continent. I lay on my white coverlet in the sunlight, eating an orange with sticky fingers and reading my mail. Outside, the streets were covered with hard snow, but the sun shone brazenly across the high rooftops. A rooster gargled into the quiet afternoon as I turned another page of my letter. I gave an indignant snore. "What's the matter?" my mother asked, rubbing her stockinged feet where she lay on the other bed. I had discovered by now, from Robert's letters, that his parents were particularly opposed to the match their son proposed to make. As far as I could make out, it was on grounds that I was of a different religion, irresponsible, and possibly immoral. This had naturally raised a question in my mind. Was I a virgin any longer? I had felt myself blushing at the thought. At the same time, I couldn't help smiling. Of course I was a virgin. Robert's indignation at his mother's accusations seemed clearly to point towards this. Now he was saying that perhaps we should put off our wedding another year, for on that condition only would his father help set him up in business, as he had promised. The snort had been driven from me by a sudden indignation that Robert should think I wanted to marry him, ever. This indignation was unreasonable, for I had done all I could to foster the illusion in my letters to him, but the situation was beginning to irritate me. Just as silly parents, I said to my mother. He thinks we should wait another year in case they cut him off with a shilling. My mother hesitated, then said with a timid smile, as though trying to make a joke of it, "Do you think he really will marry you? Everything might seem different when you see each other again." For some reason, this infuriated me. "Oh, Mummy!" I spat a pip onto my saucer. "Don't you start!" I wasn't quite sure what I meant, but it evidently didn't surprise her, because she dropped her eyes and began to peel an orange for herself. "What does Nairi have to say?" "Oh, Nairi." I picked up an air letter from my previous flatmate in Wellington. It was the first she had written me. "Oh, she thinks she's in love with someone down in Christchurch, only she didn't realise till he just got engaged to someone else," I said rather flatly. "Poor Nairi. I expect she missed you when you went. She was never really one of the gang, was she?" "Oh, not really. She thought they were crazy," I added with sudden intuition. "Yes, but you had such good times together," my mother went on. "I've still got some of your letters. I thought I might make a comedy play out of them one day, if you didn't object. Of course, they'd have to be censored a bit." She laughed, but when I turned to her, I found she was looking at me curiously. "You're a lot quieter now. Perhaps it's the lack of company. I think I'll get you some B1s. "Let's go down to the restaurant," I said quickly, sliding off the bed into my boots. I could do with a huddle over the stove. I suppose Daddy's still talking to that man. The restaurant was long and clean and empty-looking. The typical shiny black stove wound its way up into the ceiling. A group of thickly coated men were devouring mussels at one end of the room, and the irregular click of the shells divided the silence into pieces. We sat and sipped café russe, licking away the smooth cream from our lips. My father was busy talking to a man from the university, and soon we got into conversation with his long-faced daughter, who spoke halting English. Before she spoke, she would look away hurriedly and mutter to herself, finding the right words. During these intervals, I found myself looking with furtive fascination at her very bad acne. It was not a common thing in Michold, in the same way that sickness was less common, with the exception of a mild form of diabetes. Therefore, I couldn't help being slightly revolted. At the same time, it touched a chord in my memory. Then I thought of Robert's photographs and of the shadowy patches that could quite well have been acne. But surely, could I have been attracted by someone with pimples? Yet the more I thought about it, the nearer I seemed to be getting to Robert. Again, it was smells which came to mind first, smells of tobacco and saliva. Then across my sight swam a picture of a frayed jersey and of a figure sitting with one knee raised on an old colonial couch. I could see the face quite clearly now. It was strangely fixed, and there were tears upon it, large wet tears. Before I had time to be astonished, I could see myself in a green wool frock and flat red earrings, toasting cheese on a crumbed and rusty oven tray. My hair had fallen over my forehead, and the thing I noticed mainly were my badly cared for hands and broken nails. Both these pictures were so clear that I remained staring into my glass cup when the girl had finished her careful speech. Then I blurted, "Oh yes, it must be very difficult," hoping this was the right thing to say, and looked back at my nails. They were now well kept and varnished. "Aren't you going to finish your drink, Di? What are you thinking of? I thought you'd be better company, I must say." Chapter 10. The next place I remember most clearly is Vienna. We arrived there late at night and stacked our suitcases in the almost deserted station cafe. We had travelled at the last minute on a smaller train than usual and hadn't been able to change money after crossing the border, as we'd expected to. We had had nothing to eat but a boiled egg each and a sip of chamomile tea which a little German woman had offered us. Fortunately, the change office had been opened when our train came in. Now we bought rolls and sausages and warm, fluffy coffee, glancing at each other in grateful anticipation as we bore them to the table. The coffee tasted unexpectedly rubbery, but the sausages were strong and good, with blobs of creamy mustard. "There'll be a load of mail at the hotel," my mother said through greasy lips. We had given our friends addresses and dates on which to write to us where we had known them. It was nearly a fortnight now since we had had any mail. At the hotel, a fat young man in a bright blue jersey led us up the bare corridor, past the bar door, which hummed with noise, and a broken cigarette machine, to our bedroom. He presented us with the door key, attached to a big red rubber ball with a number on it, and backed his way out, smiling. There were 3 beds with big white soufflé eiderdowns, and my mother sank onto the middle one, sending it puffing up on either side of her. I pounced on the pile of letters on the table and dealt them out like cards. There were 3 for me, from Robert, Stephen, and Barry Morrison. I was laughing my way through Barry's harmless pornographies when my mother said suddenly, disapprovingly, "I don't know why you encourage Barry to write to you." "Why shouldn't I asked with real curiosity. "It isn't him particularly. It's just that I don't think it's quite fair to Robert, keeping up a correspondence with other boys." I was surprised. I had thought she held a secretly low opinion of Robert, but here she was defending him. "Why, surely you don't object to Stephen?" I held up his unopened letter. "He's just a friend of the family." "To stretch a point, I'd rather you wrote to Kathleen." "Oh, I have done. I think she prefers talking to writing." I rolled over onto my back and tore Stephen's letter open with careful casualness. His writing was hurried and sprawled, but he wrote humorously and intelligently. The first page was a detailed account of his latest visit to the dentist, which had apparently been long overdue. I imagined him sitting stiffly in the dentist's chair, with the white bib clipped around his throat. The picture filled me with a pleasant feeling of intimacy. It was only next morning that I woke with a heavy throbbing in my lower jaw. I groaned, reaching for the mirror and examining my teeth. "Trust Di to get toothache in a foreign country," my mother frowned as I dressed with one hand to my face. "And that wretched plug gurgled all night, keeping me awake. Oh, Gerald, these pipes are cold now. You just see, there won't be any water. There, it's icy. Where did you pack the burner?" My father had risen and breakfasted earlier, as he intended to spend the day at the university, so my mother and I entered the restaurant together and headed for a table away from the smoke of the early customers' cigarettes. "I know why the room was so cheap now," my mother said, munching a roll and jam. "They expect to make their money out of the food. We'll eat out after this. The coffee's good anyway." "No, thank you. My tooth." I looked round me drearily. "Oh, Di, is it really bad? Perhaps we could find a dentist. I'll ask the proprietor. Would you go to one?" "Maybe he'll yank it out when he doesn't need it." "Well, make up your mind." "Oh, all right. I suppose I'll have to if I don't want it to spoil the whole trip. Bother Stephen writing about his dentist. I'm sure I would never have thought of having toothache otherwise. I laughed. I'll never forget my visit to Ludwig. His second name didn't impress me, and I've forgotten it. I had had little experience of real pain in my very dull life, as I now judged it, and I was hardly prepared for the sharp spike of the drill. We found this dentist up a dusty wooden staircase at one end of a shadowy corridor. The waiting room was crowded with fat, apprehensive Austrians, but for some reason I was ushered ahead of them. Ludwig himself spoke no English, but a young man in the waiting room was asked to stand by and translate my remarks. His English was fluid, but garbled. "I don't want it out," I mouthed firmly and clearly at him, and gripped the chair arms as he translated. Ludwig went about his job with earnest concentration and relentless brutality. His black brows lurched down over my frightened face and withdrew as suddenly. "The pain is less," a voice said in my ear. I nodded, speechless with shock, and staggered up from the chair. My mother met me in the waiting room as I came out unsteadily in my clumsy boots. "All right." "Dead," I said thickly, and followed her down the stairs with my chin held stiffly at an angle. The hotel proprietor greeted us with a broad grin. All right, a good dentist, huh? A good dentist." "Very good," my mother spoke for me. "And it's only temporary," I groaned as we reached the bedroom. "Did he say? Well, never mind, dear. Think of the concert tonight." "I think I'll write to Stephen and tell him off." "All right, dear. It's your affair." She shrugged her fur coat onto the bed. She was wearing a red twin set, and I noticed how it suited her. I thought of my first experience of this colour and the sharp pain it had given me to look at it. Now it was a colour I was particularly fond of, although I had no clothes in it myself. "How grey Germany is," my mother had said in Cologne. "Perhaps it's the time of year," I had agreed with her wholeheartedly, and yet it occurred to me soon after that it was the type of dull greyness that I had been so well used to in Mécold. My values must be changing already. The idea of this no longer filled me with panic. I was quite content to be influenced by this other self whose place I had taken over. I noted each change in myself with interest and even pleasure. By now I felt quite at home with my parents, a thing I would never have believed possible a few weeks back. Lying across the bed, I pulled my writing pad towards me and began on my letter to Stephen. It had been arranged that I would accompany my parents as far as Syracuse, when they would continue on to Malta to pick up their boat on its way to New Zealand, and I would travel back to Paris by train, then catch the boat to England. I intended to find another job and stay in London for a further 4 or 5 months before I caught the boat, on which I had a berth, back to Wellington and Robert. I told Stephen of my plans, hoping they would interest him. I had discovered a lot of things from the week spent with my parents, and had the facts about myself ranged in much more order. This had given me greater confidence in myself and even room to relax a little. I think I behaved more naturally. My mother had expressed her pleasure at seeing me perking up, more myself. As the ache in my jaw subsided, I found my painful visit to the dentist had left me strangely exhilarated. Somehow the experience had done me good. Its brutality had bared another of my senses, as my first glimpse of the red bus had done. I was beginning to think of my senses as covered by layer upon layer of protective bandage. Now I was discarding it, as apparently was necessary in this world. The idea excited me with its unknown quantities, and I rolled away from my letter restlessly. "Won't we go into the clock museum?" I asked. "Let's go now, shall we? My tooth feels fine, and I'm hungry too." I left my parents at Syracuse, as planned, and took the 7:15 morning train for Rome. The carriage was empty to begin with, and I spread my things about me on the seat. My Saturday Evening Post and sunglasses, my camera in its canvas case. This case had been bought separately and was far too large for the camera. Down the side I had crammed 2 hard-boiled eggs and a bread roll for my lunch. In Italy I had my first experience of spring in this new world. We had travelled into the hotter weather almost overnight, and it had taken me by surprise as much as the cold had done in London. It was several degrees warmer than I had ever known our hot season to be in the cold, and the coolest clothes I had in my suitcase were a blouse and skirt, which I wore now. At this time it was early April, and I had learnt that it would be spring in England, though cooler than Italy. I was looking forward to this. In fact, there were a lot of things to look forward to, quite suddenly. Stephen had written telling me he had arranged to spend Easter in Paris, and as I would be arriving there at about the same time, suggested I stay on a few days and enjoy the sights with him. "Don't expect that I'll show you a wild nightlife," he wrote. "It'll be my first time in Paris, and also I'm not very rich at present." Nevertheless, my imagination flew ahead of me in anticipating these few days. During our trip, I had tired of watching the scenery from the train and joined my father in reading paperbacked novels. I thought of the Paris of Somerset Maugham, and my toes curled with excitement. With my parents, I had stayed only one night in Paris before leaving next morning for Louvain. As we were leaving, my father had booked a room for me for the night I intended to stay there on my way back to England. I wrote to tell Stephen of this, and wasn't long in getting his reply. "I've managed to book a room at the same hotel, and I've told them you'll need your room till the end of the week." So it was all settled. I didn't tell my parents of my changed plans, and hoped that my impatience with the rest of our holiday wasn't too apparent. The carriage soon filled at Taormina, and I confined myself to the window seat. The warm foreign voices splashed over me, and I felt a mood of recklessness come upon me. A dark Italian-looking boy with very bright eyes and teeth kept turning these upon me with an engaging grin, and I took up my magazine quickly. His eye fell on it. "Oh, you're English?" I nodded, stiffening. "But I speak a little English. I lived there for a little time. It is a good country, England. You like Italy?" "Yes. Well, I haven't been here long." "It's not my country, you know. My country is Romania." He began to tell me about this place where he was born. "So you are English," he went on suddenly. "Yes, when I was in England there was a girl I knew very well. We lived together a long time. It was only a few months ago. Then I came over here." Fascinated, I waited for him to go on talking. He did so. "My English girl, she was not really beautiful, you know, but she had a wonderful heart. Being with her was like being married. Nothing but just to save the money, you know, and be happy together. You don't know what that girl was capable of. Unselfish." "She must have loved you," I said rather hoarsely. "I think, yes, she is suffering, you know. When you have been with a person that way, you remember. She will forget me, you know, if she lives with another man. But not for a while, I think." "She might always remember you," I surprised myself by saying. In fact, the whole conversation surprised me, to put it mildly. After all, here we had only met a few minutes ago, and now this young man— "Oh, no, I don't think she'll always remember me." He laughed. After a pause, he went on, "You are a good girl. I can see you are a good girl." I looked bewildered, and he said quickly, teasingly, "Perhaps you don't like that, but what I mean is some girls, and English girls too, they lead a man on, and then, no! If a girl is like that, you know, I am mad. I beat her. I don't care. As if she were a man. Hurt her. But if she is honest with me, I am good with her. There was a Polish girl, you know, who was like that. Rotten, but lovely, lovely. I thought I'd get her one day, acting the Spaniard. Make myself speak the broken English, you know. Plenty cigarettes, Americano. and she was a bit drunk, didn't realize. And when I got her home, I locked the door. Click! No escape. Then we make love a little, and when I'm getting to the point, no, she jumped like that. But by now I know she is no angel. So I beat her this way, that, and she sang Santa Maria, Catholic, And I say to her, don't bring the name of a saint into this situation, because you are a stinker. And soon she say, would I let her go if she let me have what I wanted? So I say, of course, though by now I hate her. But I never refuse a girl if she wants me. But I am like a dog with her, Just as she starts to get the pleasure, finish, like that. Oh, she was mad, cursing at me in Polish. And I understand, of course. I know the Slavic languages, and I laughed. She was mad, mad. We had stopped, and he jumped to the window to buy a bottle of cheap wine from a passing refreshment wagon. I watched it wobble in the little round bottle as the train drew out. I felt shaken by the torrent of words and heard myself give a gasp for breath. It was as if I had been mentally bruised and slapped into a new awareness. You like some? Just a little, thank you. He left the train before Rome, and I was left to my Saturday evening post. However, it wouldn't be long before the train would arrive. I had a room booked in a hotel at Rome, so as to avoid having to sleep on trains. I thought of running to catch a bus from the station in the dark and felt suddenly frightened. Of course, I could get a taxi. Then I had an idea. Suppose I went straight on to Milan and then to Paris. Stephen was arriving a day before I was due, so he would be there already. Impatience to see him urged me to do so. Surely I could get a room somewhere, if not at the same hotel. A porter at Rome directed me to the Milan train, which was just leaving. Corrente, corrente, he shouted, and I ran with my suitcase bumping against my legs. The train was full of soldiers going home for Easter. Several of them tried to make a pass at me, so I spent the night on a small seat outside the ladies' toilet, where I felt safer. My experience was widening quite suddenly. I left the train at Milan, feeling curiously light-headed, and realized that I'd eaten nothing but one egg since Syracuse. After finding what time the Paris train left, I checked in my luggage and went out to find a trattoria. Here I had a meal of spaghetti and my remaining boiled egg. I still had quite an amount of Italian money left, which I had intended to spend in Rome. In the same mood of recklessness, I walked in the hot city sun and bought a rather unusual summer frock, catching my train at the very last minute. I noticed my fingernail had broken.